During what seemed like a peaceful morning, a rich man, wearing elegant clothes, takes his 75-year-old wheelchair-bound mother for a special outing he had promised. When the lady, afraid of heights, realizes they are getting dangerously close to the edge, with her hands already trembling, she asks, "Son, why are we here?" The son remains silent. His heart races when he realizes what he's doing, but still pushes her with all his might into the abyss. He turns around, flees to his luxury car, while hearing the elderly woman scream, disappearing into the precipice. But he didn't know that a large white horse witnessed everything, and what happens in the next seconds leaves everyone in pure shock. The cold morning wind whispered through the cliffside rocks like an omen as Helen Sterling watched the landscape through her bedroom window. At 75, her silver hair shone in the golden light of the rising sun, and her blue eyes still held the spark of determination that had guided her through her entire life. Her wrinkled hands, marked by time and wisdom, carefully held a sealed envelope containing the most important document of her existence. Inside that envelope was her last will, a testament that designated 90% of her fortune to charitable institutions. It was a decision she had been nurturing for months, ever since she discovered the true extent of her wealth and understood the transformative power it could have in the lives of less fortunate people. Helen had always believed that true wealth wasn't in what one accumulated, but in the good ones spread throughout the world. Outside, the family's white horse, Tempest, grazed peacefully in the verdant field that stretched to the cliff's edge. The 15-year-old animal knew every corner of the coastal Maine estate and every member of the Sterling family. There was something almost magical in the way he seemed to understand human emotions, especially Helen's, who had always treated him with special affection. The bedroom door opened unceremoniously, revealing the imposing figure of Richard Sterling, her only son. At 40, he carried the typical arrogance of men born with a silver spoon in their mouths, who never had to fight for anything. His impeccable Italian suit and gleaming leather shoes contrasted with the rustic simplicity of the rural environment where he had grown up. His dark eyes shone with an intensity that Helen couldn't quite decipher, but which had lately left her unsettled. "Good morning, Mother," he said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Sleep well? I've noticed you've been a bit on edge lately." Helen held the envelope tighter, her heart quickening. She knew the time had come to reveal her decision, even knowing the consequences could be devastating. "Richard, I need to talk to you about something very important. It's about my will." Richard's smile vanished instantly, replaced by a look of high alert. He approached the wheelchair where his mother sat, and Helen could feel the tension radiating from him like heat from a furnace. For the past few months, he had mentioned the financial troubles of his companies several times, always indirectly, but Helen was no fool. She realized he was counting on his inheritance to solve his difficulties. "What kind of talk, Mother?" he asked, forcing a casual tone that couldn't completely mask his anxiety. Helen took a deep breath, gathering all the courage she possessed. "And I've decided to donate the majority of my estate to charity. There are so many people in need out there, Richard, entire families who don't have enough to eat, children without access to education, elderly people who have been abandoned. Our fortune can transform hundreds of lives." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard stood motionless for what felt like an eternity, processing his mother's words. When he finally reacted, his face had twisted into a mask of poorly disguised fury. The muscles in his jaw tightened, and Helen felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. "You can't be serious," he muttered, his voice low and dangerous. "After everything we've built, after all my companies, you want to give our money to strangers. They're not strangers, Richard. They're human beings who need help. And as for your companies..." Helen paused, choosing her words carefully. "Perhaps it's time you learned to build something with your own hands, like your father did." The mention of the family's late patriarch was the last straw. Richard leaned over his mother's chair, his face inches from hers. "How about we take a walk to the cliffs? We need to discuss this calmly, away from prying ears." Helen felt her blood run cold, but she nodded slowly, hiding the envelope in the folds of her blouse. Richard pushed the wheelchair along a dirt path that snaked toward the cliff, his firm, determined steps contrasting with the subtle tremor that took hold of Helen's body. The morning sun cast long, dramatic shadows over the rugged terrain, and the wind rising from the chasm carried a chill that seemed to penetrate to the bone. With every foot they covered, Helen felt a growing unease she couldn't fully explain. "You know, Mother," Richard said, in breaking the tense silence, "I've always loved this place. Remember when I was a kid and used to come here to fly my kite? You were always so nervous, saying it was too dangerous for a child to play so close to the edge." Helen forced a smile, trying to find in her son's voice a trace of the loving child he had once been. "I remember. You were so stubborn, just like your father. Always wanted to do things your way, even when we knew there were safer paths." "Safer paths," he repeated, with a tone Helen couldn't interpret. "Sometimes I wonder if always taking the safest path keeps us from reaching our true goals." They were getting closer to the cliff's edge, and Helen could hear the distant echo of the wind hitting the rocks below. The depth of the chasm had always impressed her, but now, confined to the wheelchair, she felt particularly vulnerable. Her hands clenched the armrests as she realized Richard showed no sign of stopping at a safe distance. "Richard, we're close enough," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "We can talk right here." But he kept pushing the chair, bringing it perilously close to the edge. "Don't worry, Mother. I'd never let anything bad happen to you. After all, we're family, aren't we?" Helen felt the document hidden in her blouse as if it were a burning coal. That paper represented not only her desire to help the needy, but also the confirmation that she knew all too well the greedy character her son had developed over the years. She had secretly hoped Richard would receive the news with maturity, perhaps even with pride in her generosity. How foolish she had been. "About this donation business," Richard continued, finally stopping the chair just 6 feet from the precipice, "I need you to understand my position. My companies are going through some temporary difficulties. Investments that seemed like sure things turned out to be traps. I need this money, Mother. I need my inheritance." The possessive way he said, "my inheritance," made Helen shudder. "Richard, that money was never yours. It was built by generations of honest work, and now it can do a much greater good than simply maintaining a lavish lifestyle." "A greater good?" His voice rose, filled with disbelief and barely contained fury. "You think supporting strangers is more important than helping your own son, your own family?" Helen turned in her chair to face him, and what she saw in his eyes terrified her. There was no love there anymore, no respect, not even recognition that she was his mother. There was only a desperate hunger, a need that had transformed her son into something she no longer recognized. "Richard, you're not the child I raised," she said softly, her voice choked with pain. "When did money become more important than the values I tried to teach you?" The question seemed to strike a raw, dangerous nerve in him. His hands clenched the handles of the chair, his knuckles turning white from the pressure. "Values don't pay debts, Mother. Values don't save companies from bankruptcy. Values don't maintain a man's dignity when he loses everything. Dignity is built with character, not with money," Helen replied, feeling an inner strength she didn't know she possessed. "And character is shown precisely in the most difficult moments." It was then that she noticed the definitive shift in his expression. The civilized mask finally fell away, revealing something cold and calculating that made her understand, with terrifying clarity, that this walk to the cliffs had been no coincidence. The silence that settled between mother and son was thick with a palpable tension. Helen could feel her heart pounding so hard it hurt. while Richard remained motionless behind her chair, his hands still gripping the handles tightly. The wind rising from the chasm seemed to whisper warnings she was finally beginning to understand with terrible clarity. "You really don't get it, do you?" Richard said, his voice taking on a cold tone Helen had never heard before. "You don't understand what it means to lose everything when you have so much to lose. When you have a reputation to maintain, commitments to honor, an image to preserve." Helen tried to turn fully in her chair to face him, but he kept his hands firmly in place, preventing her from moving. The feeling of being trapped made her stomach clench with fear. "Richard, let me turn to face you properly. I don't like talking like this with my back to you. It's better this way, Mother, easier for both of us." The coldness in his voice was more frightening than if he had been shouting. "You know, I spent the last few weeks figuring out how to solve my problems. I thought about asking for a loan, using your inheritance as collateral. But then I found out you had already seen a lawyer. Imagine my surprise to learn my own mother was plotting behind my back." "I wasn't plotting anything," Helen protested, indignation mixing with her growing fear. "I was exercising my right to decide the fate of my own assets. And how did you know I saw a lawyer?" A low, humorless laugh escaped Richard's lips. "You've always been too naive, Mother. Did you really think you could do something like this without me finding out? I have contacts in every major firm in the state. When Helen Sterling schedules a consultation to change a will involving a $50 million fortune, people talk." Helen felt her blood run cold. $50 million. She knew the family was wealthy, but she had never imagined the amount was so exorbitant. Suddenly, Richard's extreme reaction began to make a terrible kind of sense. For him, it wasn't just money. It was a fortune capable of solving any problem and maintaining a life of luxury for generations. "Now, do you understand why I can't let you go through with this madness?" he continued, leaning over the chair until Helen could feel his breath on her neck. $50 million, Mother. Do you have any idea what that represents? It's enough to save my companies, pay off every debt, and still leave me rich for the rest of my life. And you think you're entitled to that money just because you're my son?" Helen's voice trembled, but there was a firmness in it that surprised her. "You think that because you were born into our family, you automatically deserve a fortune without having done anything to earn it?" The question seemed to touch an exposed nerve. Richard abruptly stepped away from the chair and began pacing like a caged animal. "Who'd done nothing? I spent my whole life being the perfect son. I went to the best schools, graduated with honors, built a business empire. An empire that is now crumbling," Helen observed with a calmness she didn't feel. "And one that was built on expectations of money that was never yours." "It was mine by right," he exploded, stopping abruptly and turning to her with his eyes blazing with fury. "I am your only heir. That money was supposed to be mine automatically when you died." The word "died" hung in the air like a tangible threat. A shiver ran down Helen's spine as she understood the sinister implication behind the phrase. Her fingers moved instinctively to the document hidden in her blouse, as if it could offer some protection against what was unfolding. "When I died," she repeated slowly. "Interesting choice of words, Richard. And when exactly? Did you imagine that would happen?" The silence that followed was more eloquent than any answer. It stretched out like an eternity, punctuated only by the wind moaning through the cliffside rocks. Helen could feel the weight of Richard's gaze on her, a gaze that no longer held any trace of the filial love she had known for 40 years. It was as if she were facing a stranger, someone who wore her son's face but possessed the soul of a completely different creature. "You know," Richard said finally, resuming his position behind the chair, "I've always admired your intelligence, Mother. Even now, I can see that sharp mind working, trying to find a way out of this uncomfortable situation. Helen remained silent, all her instincts screaming that any word could be used against her. The document in her blouse seemed to burn against her skin, a constant reminder that it was the only barrier between Richard and the fortune he so desperately coveted. "But you know what's funny?" he continued, beginning to push the chair a few inches closer to the edge. "All your wisdom, all your life experience, and you couldn't see what was right in front of you. You didn't realize that your own son had become your greatest enemy." The movement of the chair made Helen grip the armrests tightly, vertigo seizing her mind as she glanced down into the abyss. The depth was terrifying, the sharp rocks at the base of the cliff looking like teeth, waiting to devour anything that fell from above. "Richard, for God's sake, move the chair away from the edge," she pleaded, no longer able to maintain her composure. "What do you think you're doing?" "I'm solving a problem," he answered with terrifying calm. "No, a problem you created when you decided to give my money to strangers. You see, Mother, I discovered some interesting things when I looked into your financial situation. I found out you're even richer than I imagined. And I also found out that if something were to happen to you before this will was officially filed, I would inherit everything automatically." Helen felt the world spin. The reality of the situation finally crystallized in her mind with brutal clarity. Her son hadn't brought her here for a conversation. He had brought her here to kill her. "You've gone completely insane," she whispered, her voice hoarse with horror. "You're talking about murdering your own mother for money. For money, Richard." "It's not just for money," he replied, leaning in to speak close to her ear. "It's for survival. You don't understand the pressure I've been under. The banks want their collateral. The investors want results. My partners want explanations. Without this money, I'm nothing. I'm just another failed businessman who lost everything. And you think that justifies taking the life of the one who gave you life?" Hot tears streamed down Helen's face, but she didn't know if she was crying from sorrow or anger. "Do you think your father would be proud of the man you've become?" The mention of his dead father seemed to hit Richard like a slap. For a moment, his mask of coldness faltered, revealing a deep pain and a confusion that perhaps even he didn't fully understand. "My father is dead, Mother, and the dead don't pay debts or save reputations. But the living carry the conscience," Helen said, desperately trying to find something human in the son she had known. "Will you be able to live with this? Will you be able to sleep knowing you killed the woman who loved you unconditionally from the day you were born?" Richard straightened up slowly, and when he spoke again, his voice had regained all its previous coldness. "I'll be able to live very well with $50 million, thank you." He positioned his hands firmly on the back of the chair, and Helen understood that the final moment had come. In desperation, she tucked the document deeper into her blouse, hoping that her death would at least not result in Richard's complete victory. A few yards away, Tempest, the family's white horse, had stopped grazing and was now watching the scene with disturbing intensity. His ears were pricked, catching every nuance of the tense conversation between mother and son. And something in his animal instinct recognized the danger that hung in the air like a gathering storm. Helen noticed the animal's presence, and for a desperate moment, her eyes met the horse's. It was as if Tempest could understand her anguish, for he began to approach slowly, his hooves clattering on the loose stones. The sound seemed to irritate Richard, who turned briefly to watch the animal. "Always so attached to this stupid horse," he muttered with disdain. "Dad used to say you talked to him like he was a person. How ridiculous." "Tempest has always been more loyal than you ever were," Helen retorted, finding unexpected strength in the animal's presence. "He never betrayed me, never threatened me, never thought of harming me for his own gain." The comparison seemed to enrage Richard even more. "An animal can't give you the comfortable life I've always provided. An animal doesn't build companies or create jobs. An animal has no ambitions or dreams. Nor does it have greed or cruelty," Helen replied. And I would 1,000 times prefer the honest company of Tempest to the venomous deceit of a son who only sees me as an obstacle between him and his money. Tempest was now only a few feet away, and his behavior had become visibly agitated. The horse whinnied softly, a sound that carried something Helen could have sworn was concern. His large, expressive eyes darted between her and Richard, as if he were assessing the situation and trying to decide how to react. What an interesting coincidence," Richard said, watching the horse with a calculating expression. "Tempest will be the only witness to your tragic accident. Of course, he won't be able to tell anyone how his dear owner tried to get too close to the edge to admire the view and ended up losing control of her wheelchair." Helen felt her blood run cold as she heard the plan unfold in her son's sick mind. "You have it all planned out, don't you? You've thought of every detail of my death. It wasn't difficult," he admitted with a coldness that terrified her. "An elderly woman in a wheelchair, alone with her son in a dangerous place, a moment of distraction, a sudden movement. And there you have it, a terrible but understandable accident. I'll be devastated, of course. Everyone will console me for the tragic loss of my dear mother. And Tempest, you think he'll stand by quietly while you kill the person who raised him from a foal?" Richard looked at the horse with contempt. "Animals get used to change quickly. In a few weeks, he won't even remember you, and if he becomes a problem, well, accidents happen to horses too." The veiled threat against Tempest was the last straw for Helen. All the sadness and fear she felt transformed into a purifying rage. "You're a monster," she said, her voice trembling with indignation. "A monster that I unknowingly created. Where did I go so wrong to produce a creature like you?" "You went wrong when you spoiled me," Richard answered, moving to the side of the chair. "When you gave me everything I wanted without teaching me that sometimes you have to take what's yours by right." Tempest, as if sensing the escalating tension, took a few steps forward and let out a louder whinny, almost like a warning. The sound echoed across the cliffs, momentarily breaking the evil spell that seemed to envelop the scene. "Shut up, you stupid animal!" Richard shouted, for the first time losing the cold composure he had maintained throughout the conversation. And it was in that moment of distraction that Helen made the bravest decision of her life. With a swift movement, she pulled the document from her blouse and threw it as far as she could, in the opposite direction of the abyss. The document flew through the air like a wounded bird, landing among the rocks several yards away. Richard watched its trajectory with wide eyes, immediately understanding the significance of his mother's desperate act. For a moment, he hesitated between running for the paper or dealing with Helen first. "You cunning old woman," he snarled, the mask of civility finally shattering completely. "You think that will stop me? You think throwing the document away will save your life?" Helen felt a strange sense of peace settle over her heart. She had done what she could to protect her final wish, and now all that was left was to face the consequences with the dignity she had always tried to maintain. "I did what was right, Richard, something you could never understand." Tempest, witnessing the growing agitation, began to trot toward the fallen document. As if instinctively understanding its importance, the horse sniffed the paper and then raised his head, looking directly at Helen with an expression she could have sworn was one of comprehension and support. "Even if you get the document back," Helen said with a serenity that surprised her, "it won't change anything. My decision is made. My conscience is clear. And you, Richard, will have to live forever knowing you killed your own mother for greed." "I won't be living with anything but $50 million!" he yelled, positioning himself firmly behind the wheelchair. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, remembering the good times when Richard was just an innocent child, running through the fields of the estate, laughing and playing with Tempest. Where had that child gone? At what point had greed devoured his soul? "And I forgive you," she whispered, and the words seemed to hit Richard like daggers. "I don't want your forgiveness," he screamed, his hands trembling with rage on the chair's handles. "I want my inheritance." With a sudden, violent motion, Richard shoved the wheelchair toward the edge of the cliff. Helen felt the world move in slow motion, the wind from the abyss rising to meet her, the sharp rocks below approaching with terrifying speed. Tempest let out a shrill neigh of panic and protest, a sound that echoed across the cliffs like a battle cry. The horse bolted toward the edge, as if trying, in some impossible way, to intercept the fall of the woman who had raised him with such care. Helen felt the wheelchair shatter on the first impact against the protruding rocks, her body thrown against the sturdy branches of a tree growing out of the cliffside. The pain was intense and immediate, but she remained conscious enough to cling desperately to the branches, avoiding a fatal fall to the bottom of the chasm. Up above, Richard ran to the edge and looked down, searching for signs of life. When he saw Helen caught in the branches several yards below, his first reaction was frustration. She had survived, and her survival posed a huge problem for his plans. Tempest remained on the cliff's edge, neighing incessantly, as if trying to communicate with Helen or call for help. The animal seemed to understand that something terrible had happened, and his agitation was evident to anyone who might see him. "Damn it," Richard muttered, realizing he couldn't just leave Helen there. If someone found her alive, she could tell the truth about what had happened. He needed a new strategy, and he needed it fast. Glancing around to make sure there were no witnesses besides the horse, Richard ran to where the document lay, picked it up and stuffed it in his pocket. Then he returned to the edge and shouted down, "Don't worry, Mother, I'm going to get help." But Helen, even injured and in shock, knew very well that the only help Richard would seek was to finish what he had started. Richard scrambled down the steep incline, finding a treacherous path among the rocks that would lead him to where Helen was trapped. Every step was calculated, every move planned with the cold precision of someone who had definitively crossed the line between sanity and madness. He could not allow his mother to survive and tell the truth about what had happened on the cliff. But what Richard didn't realize, in his obsession to silence Helen forever, was that Tempest had become much more than a simple witness. The horse, with an intelligence that bordered on the supernatural, understood that he had to act. His instincts drove him to protect the woman who had always treated him with kindness, and he would not stand by while she was in danger. While Richard struggled to descend to the rocky ledge where Helen clung to the branches, Tempest made a decision that would completely change the course of events. The horse bolted toward the main house of the estate, galloping with an urgency that immediately caught the attention of Joe Garcia, the groundskeeper who had worked for the family for over 20 years. Joe was mending a fence near the house when he saw Tempest approaching at a full gallop, neighing loudly and repeatedly. The animal's behavior was so unusual that the groundskeeper immediately dropped his tools and ran toward the horse. "What is it, Tempest? What's wrong, boy?" Joe asked, trying to calm the agitated animal. But Tempest wouldn't calm down. Instead, he began to run in circles around Joe, then would head a few yards toward the cliffs and back, as if trying to communicate something urgent. The groundskeeper, who had grown up in the countryside and knew how to read animal behavior, understood at once that something was very wrong. "Mrs. Sterling," Joe muttered, a shiver of fear running down his spine. "Where's Mrs. Sterling? Tempest?" The horse neighed loudly and began to gallop toward the cliffs, occasionally stopping to look back and make sure Joe was following. The groundskeeper, even at 60, ran after the animal with surprising agility, his heart pounding with worry. Meanwhile, down on the rocky ledge, Helen fought to stay conscious. Her arms ached terribly from the effort of clinging to the branches, and she could feel cuts and bruises all over her body. But the physical pain was nothing compared to the emotional pain of knowing her own son had tried to kill her. Richard finally reached the ledge, a few feet above where Helen was trapped. He watched her for a moment, assessing the situation with the coldness of a predator. "Well, Mother, it looks like your luck has run out." "Richard, please," Helen managed to whisper, her voice hoarse with pain and exhaustion. "There's still time to stop this madness. We can still talk, find a solution." "The only solution is for you to stop breathing," he replied with a cruelty that made Helen shudder. "And since the fall didn't do the job, I'll have to handle it another way." Richard began searching for loose rocks he could hurl at Helen when a distant sound caught his attention. It was the sound of hooves approaching quickly, accompanied by human shouts. He froze, realizing someone was coming toward the cliffs. "Mrs. Sterling! Mrs. Sterling, where are you?" yelled Joe's voice, still distant but getting closer. Richard swore under his breath, understanding that his time had run out. He couldn't be found down here, near an injured Helen, without a plausible explanation. Quickly, he began to climb back up the rocky path, his mind working furiously to concoct a convincing story. Helen heard Joe's familiar voice and felt a wave of hope wash over her. "Down here." "Joe!" she cried out with all the strength she could muster. "I'm down here." When Joe reached the edge of the cliff, accompanied by Tempest, and looked down, what he saw horrified him. Joe Garcia stood frozen for a moment, staring down at Helen, clinging precariously to the branches of the tree growing from the cliffside. The sight of the elderly woman, injured and in such a perilous situation, made his heart pound with terror and determination. 20 years of working for the Sterling family had forged bonds that went far beyond a simple professional relationship. "Oh my God, Mrs. Sterling! How on earth did you end up down there?" he shouted, his voice echoing across the chasm. "Joe, help me, please," Helen managed to reply, her voice weak but filled with relief. "I can't hold on much longer." Tempest remained agitated, trotting back and forth on the cliff's edge, whinnying softly as if he understood the gravity of the situation. Joe watched the horse's behavior, and a terrible suspicion began to form in his mind. Tempest hadn't come to get him by chance. The animal had witnessed something. "Where is Mr. Richard? Mrs. Sterling?" Joe asked, looking around and seeing no sign of her son. Helen hesitated for a moment, even after everything that had happened. Part of her still fought against the terrible reality that her own son had tried to kill her. He went to get help," she managed to say, though she knew Joe was too smart to believe that version completely. Joe noticed the hesitation in Helen's voice, and his instincts as a simple but observant man told him there was much more to this story. He had known Richard since he was a child, and had always noticed a disturbing coldness in the boy that had intensified over the years. But now was not the time for questions. Helen was in mortal danger and needed immediate help. "Mrs. Sterling, can you hold on for a few more minutes? I'm going to run to the house for a rope and some men to help with the rescue." "I don't know if I can, Joe," Helen admitted, feeling her arms tremble with exhaustion. "I'm so tired, and it hurts so much." Joe looked around desperately, searching for a more immediate solution. It was then that his eyes fell on Tempest, and an idea began to form in his mind. The horse was strong and loyal, and perhaps he could be part of the solution. "Tempest, come here, boy," Joe called, approaching the animal. "I need your help to save Mrs. Sterling." The horse seemed to understand the urgency in the groundskeeper's voice and approached docilely. Joe took off his belt and shirt, improvising a crude rope that might just be enough for a first rescue attempt. "Mrs. Sterling, I'm going to try to get down to you using Tempest as an anchor, but you have to promise me you'll hold on tight, no matter what." "I promise, Joe. Do whatever it takes." Joe tied his makeshift rope around Tempest's midsection, testing the strength of the knot. The horse stood perfectly still, as if he fully understood his role in the rescue operation. With extreme care, Joe began to lower himself down the side of the cliff, using the animal's strength as an anchor. The descent was terrifying. At any moment, the improvised rope could break, or Tempest could get spooked and move, causing an even greater tragedy. But Joe persisted, driven by the loyalty and affection he felt for Helen, who had always treated him like family. When he finally reached the ledge where Helen was trapped, Joe could see the extent of her injuries up close. She was pale, with cuts on her face and arms, and clearly in shock. But her eyes still shone with that determination he had always admired in her. "Now, for the hard part, Mrs. Sterling," Joe said, assessing how he could get her back to the surface. "You're going to have to trust me completely." It was then that he noticed something that gave him pause. There were strange marks in the dirt around the ledge, marks that seemed to indicate someone had been there recently. Joe studied the marks in the dirt with growing suspicion. They were fresh, men's footprints, clearly from someone who had climbed down to this ledge after Helen's fall. The groundskeeper felt a chill run down his spine as he understood the terrible implication of the evidence. "Mrs. Sterling," he said carefully, helping her position herself better against the rock. "Are you sure Mr. Richard went to get help? Because these footprints here tell me a different story." Helen closed her eyes for a moment, fighting against the physical and emotional pain. She knew the time had come to tell the truth, even if it meant forever destroying the image Joe had of Richard. "Joe, my son pushed me from this cliff." The words came out as a pained whisper, but Joe heard them clearly. The groundskeeper was silent for a long moment, processing the confession. 20 years of observing the Sterling family had given him insights into each member's personality, and Helen's revelation, though shocking, didn't surprise him as much as it should have. "Why would he do such a thing, Mrs. Sterling?" Joe asked, though he already suspected the answer. "For money?" Helen answered bitterly. "He found out I was going to donate the inheritance to charity and couldn't accept it. He'd rather kill me than accept the money being used to help people in need." A cold anger rose in Joe's chest. He had watched Richard grow up, had witnessed his gradual transformation from a spoiled child into a greedy and cruel man. But he had never imagined the young man would be capable of trying to murder his own mother. "We need to get you out of here now, Mrs. Sterling. And then we need to report what happened." "He'll deny everything," Helen said wearily. "It will be my word against his, and he has the money and influence to manipulate any situation." "But he wasn't counting on Tempest," Joe noted, looking up to where the horse continued to stand guard. "And he wasn't counting on me. We'll find a way to prove the truth, Mrs. Sterling. I promise you that." With extreme care, Joe secured Helen to his own body with the makeshift rope, preparing for the difficult climb back to the surface. The operation would be dangerous for them both, but it was their only chance. "Tempest!" Joe yelled. "We need you now, boy." The horse seemed to understand the call and braced himself, using all his weight to serve as an anchor. Joe began to climb slowly, carrying Helen, each movement calculated to avoid a fatal fall. The ascent seemed to last an eternity. Helen drifted between consciousness and fainting, the pain from her injuries intensified by the movement. Joe fought against exhaustion and fear, knowing that a single slip could cost both their lives. When they finally reached the top, Joe gently laid Helen on the grass, far from the cliff's edge. She was even paler, but alive. Tempest approached and gently nuzzled the face of the woman who had always cared for him, as if to make sure she was okay. "Now we need to get you to a hospital," Joe said, checking Helen's injuries. "And then we're going to the police." "Joe." Helen gripped the groundskeeper's arm with surprising strength. "Richard can't know I told you the truth. Not yet. If he finds out you know what really happened, your life will be in danger too." The groundskeeper nodded, understanding the wisdom in Helen's words. Richard had crossed a line that few men cross, and he wouldn't hesitate to silence any witness who could incriminate him. "We'll say I found you by chance," Joe agreed. "That Tempest led me here because he was agitated, and we discovered you'd had an accident." Just then, they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Richard appeared at the top of a nearby rise, panting and wearing a look of false concern. "Mother, thank God!" Richard shouted, running toward them like a desperate son. "I've been looking everywhere for you. When I came back with the new wheelchair, I went to get from the car and couldn't find you. I was terrified." Joe watched Richard's performance with a mixture of disgust and admiration for the man's ability to lie so convincingly. The story about getting a new wheelchair was clearly a fabrication, but it would be hard to dispute without concrete evidence. "Mr. Richard," Joe said, maintaining a respectful but vigilant tone, "I found Mrs. Sterling caught in the branches, a few yards below the edge. It looks like she had a terrible accident." "An accident?" Richard knelt beside Helen, touching her face with a theatrical tenderness that made her stomach turn. "How did it happen, Mother? Were you here alone?" Helen looked into her son's eyes and saw a calculating coldness disguised as concern. She understood that Richard was testing her, trying to find out how much she remembered and what she had told Joe. I don't remember clearly," Helen managed to whisper, pretending to be more confused than she really was. "I remember being in the chair, admiring the view, and then I was falling." "It must have been a dizzy spell," Richard suggested quickly. "You're at that age, Mother. Perhaps you lost consciousness for a moment, and the chair rolled toward the edge." Joe noted how quickly Richard was constructing a narrative that absolved him of any responsibility. The groundskeeper also realized that Helen was deliberately playing confused, likely to protect herself and him. "The important thing is that Mrs. Sterling is alive," Joe said, "but we need to get her to a hospital immediately. She could have internal injuries." Of course, Richard agreed, but Joe noticed a hesitation in his voice. "I'll call for an ambulance right now." "It might be faster if we take her in your car, Mr. Richard," Joe suggested. "The hospital is only 20 minutes from here." Richard seemed uncomfortable with the suggestion. The idea of being alone with Helen and Joe, knowing his mother could regain her memory at any moment, clearly disturbed him. "You're right, Joe. We'll use my car." Tempest, who had remained close throughout the conversation, suddenly positioned himself between Richard and Helen, displaying a protective behavior that did not go unnoticed by anyone present. The horse snorted softly when Richard got too close, forcing him to keep his distance. "That's strange," Richard commented, trying to sound casual. "Tempest has never acted like this with me before." "Animals sense things we don't," Joe observed, with hidden meaning. "Oh, they know when something isn't right." The phrase made Richard cast a sharp look at the groundskeeper. There was something in Joe's tone that suggested knowledge beyond what he should have. Richard began to wonder what exactly Helen had told him during the rescue. "Joe," Helen said faintly, could you come with us to the hospital? I don't feel safe. I'm still very shaken from the accident." Helen's request confirmed to Richard that she suspected him, even while feigning confusion. The situation was becoming dangerous, and he would have to be very careful with every move from now on. "Of course I will, Mrs. Sterling," Joe replied, understanding perfectly what she was really asking. "I won't leave your side." Richard forced a smile, but inside, his mind was working furiously. Helen was alive, lucid enough to suspect him, and now had an ally in Joe. Worse, Tempest seemed to have developed an instinctive dislike for him, which could draw unwanted attention. As Joe prepared Helen for transport, caring for her with the gentleness of a father, Richard discreetly checked the pocket where he had stored the donation document. At least he still had that as a trump card, even if his original plans had failed spectacularly. "Let's go, Mother," he said, helping Joe carry Helen. "We're going to take care of you." But Helen knew all too well what kind of care Richard had in mind. Oakhaven Regional Hospital was an old but well-kept building where most of the staff knew the area's prominent families. When Richard arrived carrying Helen, followed by Joe, the commotion was immediate. News that the Sterling matriarch had suffered a serious accident spread quickly through the halls. Dr. Arthur Evans, the family physician for over 15 years, met Helen in the emergency room with the genuine concern of someone who had cared for her during routine checkups for years. He immediately noted her extreme pallor, multiple cuts, and state of shock. "What happened to Helen?" the doctor asked as he organized her care. "It was a terrible accident, doctor," Richard replied with the appropriate expression of a distraught son. "She was admiring the view from the cliffs on our property when her wheelchair must have rolled toward the edge. Luckily, she got caught in the branches of a tree, or it would have been much worse." Dr. Evans examined Helen carefully, noting that despite the seemingly serious injuries, none appeared to be life-threatening. "Helen, do you remember what happened?" Helen glanced quickly at Richard and then at Joe before answering. "It's all very confusing, Doctor. I remember being in the chair, then falling, and then Joe found me. Psychological trauma is common in accidents like this," the doctor commented. "We'll run some tests to make sure there are no serious internal injuries." While Helen was taken for scans, Richard and Joe were left in the waiting room. The silence between them was thick with tension, each man knowing far more than he was willing to reveal. "It was lucky you found her," Richard finally said, studying Joe's face for any sign of suspicion. "It wasn't luck," Joe replied calmly. "It was Tempest. The horse came and got me, all agitated. Seemed to know Mrs. Sterling was in danger." Richard felt a chill at that. The idea that an animal could have so directly interfered with his plans was deeply unsettling. "Animals have strange instincts," he murmured. "They sure do," Joe agreed, but there was something in his tone that made Richard even more uncomfortable. "Especially when it comes to protecting the ones they love from those who might do them harm." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Evans with the test results. "Good news, no major fractures or signs of internal bleeding. Helen was very lucky. The injuries are mostly superficial, though she is in a state of shock." "When can we take her home?" Richard asked, eager to regain full control of the situation. "And I'd like to keep her under observation for at least 24 hours, the doctor replied. "Patients her age can develop delayed complications after traumas like this." Richard clearly disliked the answer. The thought of Helen staying in the hospital, where she could talk to other people and possibly regain her full memory, made him nervous. "Doctor, could she perhaps stay at home with special care? I can hire private nurses." Dr. Evans seemed to consider the option. "Well, if there's proper medical supervision—" "Doctor," Joe interrupted respectfully, "with all due respect, I think Mrs. Sterling would be safer here at the hospital. She's been through something very traumatic." Joe's interference visibly irritated Richard. "Joe, I appreciate your concern, but medical decisions are for the family to make." "Of course, Mr. Richard. I'm just thinking of Mrs. Sterling's well-being." Dr. Evans noticed the tension between the two men and decided to consult the patient herself. "How about we ask Helen what she would prefer?" When they returned to the room, they found Helen awake, but visibly shaken. The doctor explained the options, and she looked directly at Joe before answering. "I'd like to stay in the hospital, doctor. I still feel very confused and frightened." Richard tried to mask his frustration, but Joe caught the flash of anger that crossed his eyes. "If that's what you want, Mother, I just want you to be well." "Joe," Helen said faintly, "could you stay with me tonight? I know it's a lot to ask, but—" "Of course, Mrs. Sterling, I won't leave you alone." Richard knew he had lost this battle, but the war was not over. The early morning hours at the hospital were silent, broken only by the distant beeps of medical equipment and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hallway. Joe had fallen asleep in the armchair beside Helen's bed, but she remained wide awake, her mind racing to devise a plan that could ensure her safety and expose the truth about Richard. Around 3 in the morning, Helen heard cautious footsteps approaching her room. Her heart pounded as she recognized Richard's familiar silhouette in the dim light of the corridor. He had come back, and this time there were no nurses around to witness what might happen. Richard entered the room silently, checking that Joe was still asleep before approaching his mother's bed. His eyes had adjusted to the darkness, and Helen could see the cold, determined expression on his face. "Awake, mother," he whispered, his voice laced with a false tenderness that made Helen shudder. "Richard, what are you doing here at this hour?" she asked, trying to keep her voice low so as not to wake Joe. "I came to check on you and to discuss a few important matters." He moved closer, and Helen noticed his hands were clenched, as if he were carrying something. "What do we need to discuss that can't wait until morning?" Richard pulled the donation document he had retrieved from the cliffside out of his pocket. The paper was crumpled and stained with dirt, but still legible. "This, what you were planning to do with my inheritance?" Helen's blood ran cold. The document in Richard's hands was definitive proof that he had planned everything down to the smallest detail. "That document is worthless without my signature and the proper witnesses." "Exactly," Richard said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "And that's why we're going to make a few small changes to your plans." He pulled a pen and a new document from his other pocket. "Clearly prepared in advance. This is a much more sensible will, one that leaves the entire estate to your only son, as it should have been from the beginning. And if I refuse to sign, well," Richard glanced meaningfully at the sleeping Joe, "accidents happen, especially to loyal employees who ask too many questions and show up where they're not supposed to be." The threat against Joe made Helen realize that Richard had evolved from a greedy son into something far more dangerous. He would not hesitate to eliminate anyone who stood between him and the money. "You would kill Joe too," she whispered, horrified. "I'd kill anyone who was necessary," he answered with a coldness that terrified her. "Or $50 million justifies a lot of things, Mother." Helen looked at the document in her trembling hands. To sign would be to betray everything she believed in, but to refuse could cost an innocent man his life. It was an impossible choice between her principles and Joe's safety. "Don't look so much like a martyr," Richard muttered. "You always knew I was ambitious. You just underestimated how far I was willing to go." "I created a monster," Helen whispered, tears silently streaming down her face. "You created a survivor," he corrected, "and survivors do what is necessary." Just then, Joe stirred in the armchair, muttering something in his sleep. Richard immediately tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the pillow on Helen's bed. The implication was clear. Any false move from Joe would result in fatal consequences for her. Helen understood she had reached the most dangerous moment of her life. With a decision that required all her courage, she took the pen from Richard's hands. "All right," she said, feigning resignation, "you win." But as she pretended to sign the document, Helen screamed with all the strength she could muster. "Help! Somebody help me! My son is trying to kill me!" The scream echoed through the hospital corridors like an alarm bell, instantly waking Joe and alerting the on-duty medical staff. Helen's scream echoed through the hospital corridors like an alarm bell, waking not only Joe, but also the on-duty medical staff and the institution's security. Within seconds, the room filled with people, all wanting to understand what was happening. Richard was paralyzed for a moment, the document still in his hands, his expression shifting rapidly from confidence to panic. Dr. Evans was the first to arrive, followed by 2 nurses and a security guard, all staring at the scene with astonishment and concern. "Helen, what happened?" the doctor asked, immediately noticing the patient's agitated state and Richard's strange presence in the room in the middle of the night. "My son," Helen managed to say between sobs of relief and terror, "my son tried to force me to sign papers. He threatened me." Joe, now fully awake and grasping the gravity of the situation, protectively positioned himself between Richard and Helen. "Mr. Richard, what papers are those? And what are you doing here at this hour?" Richard tried to regain his composure, quickly hiding the documents. "My mother is still in shock from the accident. She's delirious. She doesn't know what she's saying." "I'm not delirious," Helen protested with a strength that surprised everyone. "He pushed me off the cliff. He tried to kill me for the inheritance. And now he's come back to finish what he started." A heavy silence fell over the room. Helen's accusations were so serious that no one knew how to react at first. Richard forced a nervous laugh, trying to discredit his mother's words. "You see what I'm dealing with," he said, addressing the doctor. "My own mother, who has always been so lucid, is now making up fantastic stories about her own son." But Joe took a step forward, his voice firm and determined. "Dr. Evans, I was there when I found Mrs. Sterling on the cliff. I saw the footprints on the ledge where she was trapped, footprints that could only be there if someone had climbed down to her after the fall." "You don't know what you're talking about," Richard retorted, but his voice had lost its earlier conviction. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Joe continued. "And that's not all. Tempest, the family horse, came to get me in a panic. Animals sense when something is wrong, when someone they love is in danger." Dr. Evans looked between Richard and Helen, his medical experience alerting him to the signs that this was far more than a simple accident. "Mr. Sterling, what are those documents you're hiding?" "They're personal family papers. They're no one else's business." "If they're just personal papers," the hospital security guard intervened, "you wouldn't mind showing them to us, would you?" Richard knew he was cornered. The documents in his possession, both the original will and the forged one he had prepared, would be irrefutable evidence of his criminal intent. Desperate, he played his last card. "Fine," he said, pulling the papers from his pocket. "You want to see? Here's the proof that my mother has completely lost her mind. She was planning to donate $50 million to strangers, leaving her own son with nothing." Richard's unwitting confession about the inheritance's value and his motive made everyone present instantly understand the true nature of the conflict. Helen had been telling the truth about her son's motivations. "Doctor," Helen said, finding a strength she didn't know she had, "I need you to call the police. I want to file a formal complaint against my son for attempted murder." The words fell like a final sentence. Richard looked around the room, seeing only faces of condemnation and disgust. His mask had fallen completely, revealing the greedy and dangerous creature he had become. "You don't understand," he muttered, his voice now desperate. "I deserved that money. I worked my whole life waiting for it." "You deserved the love you always had," Helen replied sadly. "But you chose the money, and now you'll have to live with the consequences of that choice." "Doctor," Evans nodded to the security guard, who was already on his radio, contacting the authorities. The truth had finally come to light, and justice was about to be served. 6 months later, on a sunny spring morning, Helen Sterling watched from the porch of her new home, a scene that filled her heart with peace and gratitude. In the well-tended garden, Joe worked among the flowers while his wife, Dolores, prepared lunch in the kitchen. The laughter of the couple's grandchildren echoed through the clean country air, creating a symphony of joy that healed wounds that had seemed incurable just months before. Tempest grazed peacefully near the fence, occasionally lifting his head to watch Helen with those intelligent eyes that had been instrumental in saving her life. The horse had become more than a pet. He was a living symbol of the loyalty and protection her own son had been unable to offer. The new house was smaller than the mansion where Helen had lived for decades, but every corner of it breathed genuine love and security. Joe and his family had become more than employees. They were the family she had chosen, united not by blood, but by affection and mutual respect. "Mrs. Sterling," Dolores called from the kitchen, "would you like me to bring your tea out to the porch?" "That would be wonderful, dear," Helen replied, smiling with a naturalness she had gradually reclaimed over the months. The legal proceedings against Richard had been painful but necessary. The evidence was irrefutable. The footprints on the cliff, Joe's testimony, the forged documents, and most damningly, Richard's own inadvertent confession at the hospital. He was convicted of attempted murder and fraud, receiving a sentence that would keep him in prison for many years. Helen had visited her son in prison only once. She found him thin, pale and seemingly remorseful, but she knew his regret stemmed more from his current situation than from a true understanding of the monstrosity of his actions. She offered her forgiveness, as she always had, but also made it clear that some choices have irreversible consequences. "Grandma Helen!" cried little Anna, Joe's granddaughter, running toward the porch with a bouquet of wildflowers in her hands. "I picked these for you." Helen accepted the gift with the emotion of someone who had rediscovered what it meant to be loved without self-interest. The 6-year-old called her Grandma, with a naturalness that warmed her heart in a way her own biological grandchildren, raised in the coldness of money, never had. "They're beautiful, my dear," Helen said, hugging the little girl. "Let's put them in a pretty vase." That afternoon, Helen was scheduled to receive visitors from the 3 institutions that had benefited from her donation. The inheritance that had nearly cost her her life was now blossoming in hundreds of transformed lives: orphaned children who found loving homes, abandoned seniors who received dignified care, and entire families who escaped poverty through job training programs. At 3 o'clock sharp, the cars arrived on the gravel road. Helen watched with quiet pride as people got out of the vehicles. Directors of orphanages, coordinators of nursing homes, community leaders, and most importantly, some of the people directly benefiting from the funds. "Mrs. Sterling," said Sister Margaret, the director of St. Clair's orphanage, "we brought something special to show you." It was a photo album showing the improvements made with part of the donation. Children smiling in renovated rooms, seniors participating in recreational activities in modern facilities, young people receiving diplomas from technical courses financed by the project. "This is what money should do," Helen thought, flipping through the pages with tears of happiness in her eyes. "Multiply smiles, create hope, dignify lives." Tempest ambled over to the porch, as if wanting to join the celebration. Helen reached out her hand to stroke the muzzle of the animal who had saved her life. And for a moment, she felt a deep connection with all the forces of good that had conspired to protect her and allow her to fulfill her dreams of generosity. As the sun set on the horizon, painting the sky in golden hues, Helen understood that she had found her true legacy. It wasn't in the accumulated money or the inherited property, but in the ability to choose love over greed, generosity over selfishness, and the family of her heart over blood ties corrupted by ambition.